You'll never become the kind of man a woman can be proud of. Vanessa didn't whisper those words. She said them beneath a crystal chandelier, loud enough for every guest in the ballroom to hear. A wave of laughter rippled across the tables. She slowly lifted her champagne glass and smiled. My ex-husband, she scoffed. He couldn't even afford the suit he's wearing. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply adjusted his worn cuff, gently set down his glass, and glanced at his watch with a calm expression that made her smile begin to fade. Then, 3 black luxury cars stopped outside the ballroom. Several men in tailored suits walked straight past Vanessa without even acknowledging her. They stopped in front of Daniel. The man leading them lowered his head respectfully. Sir, the board is waiting for you. For the first time that night, Vanessa's smile disappeared. What happened next left everyone in that ballroom speechless and changed her life forever. Stay until the end of this story. You won't believe who Daniel really is. She divorced me because I was poor. Her biggest regret came when I walked onto the stage. ASCO, you'll never become the kind of man a woman can be proud of. Vanessa Cole did not whisper those words. She said them beneath a chandelier worth more than the apartment she once shared with her husband, loud enough for every person at the table to hear. Crystal glasses paused halfway to painted lips. Silverware rested against porcelain plates. Near the marble staircase, a violinist continued playing, unaware that a 7-year marriage was being dismantled between the main course and dessert. Daniel Cole sat at the far end of the table in a charcoal suit that had been altered twice. The fabric was clean, the collar carefully pressed, but it could not hide its age. A thin line of frayed stitching showed beneath his left cuff. Vanessa had noticed it the moment they entered the ballroom. She always noticed things like that now. Across from them, Adrian Blake rested one hand beside his wine glass. He was Vanessa's regional director at Harrington Systems, a man whose watch gleamed whenever he moved and whose smile never reached his eyes. The dinner was supposed to celebrate Vanessa's promotion. Instead, it had become a public trial of the man she had married when neither of them owned anything except hope. One of her colleagues had asked Daniel what he did for a living. I work in logistics software, he answered. Vanessa laughed before he could explain. He fixes inventory problems for warehouses, she said. Mostly small ones. A few people smiled politely. Adrian leaned back in his chair. There's no shame in modest work. The sentence sounded compassionate. His expression was not. Daniel lowered his eyes to the untouched food on his plate. For 3 years, he had worked days at a shipping depot and nights developing a predictive logistics platform on an old laptop. He had turned down a better position in another city when Vanessa received her first promotion. He had emptied his savings to cover her graduate tuition. He had sold the vintage motorcycle his father left him so she could attend an executive program in London. None of those details belonged in the ballroom. Not anymore. Vanessa lifted her champagne glass. I spent years believing in potential, she said. At some point, a woman has to accept reality. The people around them became deeply interested in their napkins. Daniel looked at her. Under the warm chandelier light, she was beautiful in the way expensive things were beautiful, precise, polished, and unreachable. The silver dress she wore had cost nearly 2 months of his salary. He remembered fastening its zipper earlier that evening. She had not thanked him. Adrian's mouth curved slightly. Vanessa reached into her handbag and placed a white envelope beside Daniel's plate. The edge of a legal document showed through the opening. I filed this morning. For the first time, the violin music seemed too loud. Daniel did not touch the envelope. Vanessa removed her wedding ring. 7 years of promises caught the chandelier light for one brief second before she placed it on the tablecloth. I can't keep carrying a man who refuses to become more. Daniel looked at the ring, then at the woman he had once believed would stand beside him when the world turned cold. He could have reminded her who paid the rent during her unpaid internship. He could have told the table about the nights he waited outside her office with reheated food because she had forgotten to eat. He could have opened his laptop and shown them the platform he had spent years building, the one 3 investors had recently requested to review. Instead, he picked up the pen beside the dessert menu. His signature was steady. Vanessa seemed disappointed by that. Perhaps she had expected him to beg. Perhaps cruelty felt less satisfying without resistance. Daniel slid the papers back across the table. I hope the life you chose gives you what you're looking for. Something moved behind Vanessa's eyes. Only for a second. Then Adrian stood and offered her his arm. She took it. The two of them walked toward the dance floor while the guests pretended not to watch Daniel sitting alone beneath the chandelier. He remained there until the waiter removed Vanessa's untouched chair. Then he picked up the wedding ring. Not to keep it. He placed it inside the envelope with the divorce papers and left it on the table. Outside, rain had begun to fall. Daniel stepped into it without opening an umbrella. 3 weeks later, he stood inside an apartment where every sound echoed. The living room contained a folding table, one metal chair, 2 cardboard boxes, and an old leather sofa someone had abandoned beside the building's trash bins. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. The radiator clicked inside the wall. Beyond the window, Chicago spread beneath a winter sky, thousands of illuminated rooms belonging to people who seemed to know where their lives were going. Daniel did not. The divorce settlement had been simple. Vanessa kept the condo because the mortgage was in her name. She kept the furniture she had selected, the art she had chosen, and nearly every friend they had made after she joined Harrington Systems. Daniel left with his clothes, his laptop, a framed photograph of his father, and $43 after paying the security deposit on the apartment. On his first night there, he ate cold noodles from the container because he had forgotten to buy a fork. 2 days later, Vanessa posted photographs from Milan. In one, she stood beside Adrian on a hotel balcony with the city behind them. Her caption read, "Sometimes letting go is how you rise." Daniel stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then he placed the phone face down. He did not comment. He did not call her. He did not tell anyone that the woman smiling beside another man still appeared in his dreams, wearing the simple blue dress from their first anniversary. Pain arrived differently after midnight. During the day, Daniel could contain it with movement. He worked at the depot, answered emails, repaired broken code, and rode the bus home. At night, memory entered through every crack. Vanessa laughing as they painted their first apartment. Vanessa asleep against his shoulder during a delayed flight. Vanessa promising that money would never change what they were. Those memories were more painful than the final dinner. Cruelty could be rejected. Tenderness could not. One evening, Daniel received a voicemail from a former friend. "Vanessa said you're taking things badly. Maybe give her some space." Daniel listened twice, then deleted it. He had not contacted Vanessa once, but her version of the divorce had already spread through their social circle. According to that version, she had grown exhausted supporting an unambitious husband. Daniel had become bitter, withdrawn, and resentful of her success. People accepted the story because Vanessa wore confidence well. Daniel wore silence, and silence was often mistaken for guilt. At 1:17 every morning, however, one light remained on inside his apartment. It came from the laptop resting on the folding table. Lines of code filled the screen. His project was called Meridian. It was a logistics intelligence system designed to predict disruptions before they happened. Port delays, warehouse shortages, transportation failures, and sudden changes in demand. Companies were losing millions because their systems reacted too late. Meridian would react before the damage began. For years, Daniel had developed it in fragments. An hour before work, 30 minutes after dinner, weekends interrupted by Vanessa's social obligations. He had repeatedly placed the project aside whenever she needed him. Now there was no one left to interrupt the work. That realization hurt. Then it liberated him. Daniel began sleeping 4 hours a night. He drank black coffee because sugar cost more. He studied market data until sunrise turned his window pale gray. When the heating bill became overdue, he wore his coat indoors and kept typing. He submitted Meridian to 27 investors. 23 ignored him. 3 rejected the proposal within minutes. The final investor sent a 2-line response. "Interesting technology. Unproven founder. Too much risk." Daniel printed the rejection and taped it to the wall. Not as motivation, as evidence. The world had looked at him and seen nothing. Vanessa had done the same. For the first time, he stopped asking why. He simply returned to work. Outside, snow covered the fire escape. Inside, the laptop fan whispered through the darkness. The man Vanessa had abandoned was disappearing. Not because wealth was replacing him, because discipline was. Daniel's father had repaired elevators. For 32 years, he came home smelling of machine oil and winter air, his hands marked by cuts that never fully healed. When Daniel was 12, he once asked why his father continued fixing machines inside buildings owned by men who earned more in an hour than he earned in a month. His father had wiped grease from his fingers and smiled. Because people still need to get where they're going. Daniel had not understood the answer then. He did now. 6 months after the divorce, Meridian had still not found an investor. His savings were gone. The depot reduced his hours. His landlord taped a red notice to the apartment door. Daniel held the paper under the hallway light and read the final payment date 3 times. He had enough money for rent or server costs. Not both. That evening, he opened the last cardboard box he had avoided unpacking. Inside lay his father's tools. A voltage tester, 2 worn screwdrivers, a pair of work gloves, and beneath them, wrapped in an old towel, the brass pocket watch his father had carried every day. The watch no longer worked. It had stopped at 6:42, the exact time recorded on the hospital form when his father died. Daniel sat on the floor with the watch in his palm. For years, he had kept it because it was the only object that still seemed to contain the warmth of the man who raised him. The next morning, he sold it. The pawnshop owner examined the scratched case and offered $400. Daniel wanted to refuse. Instead, he closed his fingers once around the watch, then placed it on the glass counter. The server remained online for another month. That month changed everything. At 3:06 on a Tuesday morning, Meridian detected a pattern involving a regional food distributor. A bridge closure, a labor shortage, and an unexpected heat wave were converging across 3 states. The distributor's existing software showed no critical warning. Meridian predicted that 40% of its refrigerated shipments would fail within 72 hours. Daniel sent the company a report. No one responded. He called. A receptionist transferred him 4 times. Finally, a vice president named Sarah Kim answered. "You have 60 seconds." She said. Daniel explained the prediction in 48. Sarah was silent for the remaining 12. "What do you want?" "Access to your live routing data. You understand that information is confidential." "Yes." "And what happens when your prediction is wrong?" "You lose 5 minutes. And if it's right, you save $11 million. Sarah granted him temporary access. Meridian rerouted the shipments 6 hours before the company's traditional system recognized the disruption. The losses were reduced to less than $600,000. 2 days later, Sarah arrived at Daniel's apartment. She wore a navy coat and carried 2 coffees. Her eyes moved over the folding table, the exposed pipes, and the code projected across a cracked monitor. "You built this here?" Daniel nodded. "With a team?" "Just me." She placed 1 coffee beside him. "I resigned this morning." Daniel looked up. Sarah had spent 14 years in corporate logistics. She had managed teams across 3 continents and held equity in the distributor Meridian had just saved. "You resigned because of 1 successful forecast?" "No," she said. "I resigned because our executives spent $20 million building a system that couldn't see what 1 man in a freezing apartment saw 3 days earlier." Daniel leaned back. "I can't pay you." "I know. I don't have an office." "I noticed. I may lose this apartment next week." Sarah removed her coat and draped it over the back of the metal chair. "Then we should make the week count." By sunset, Meridian had 2 employees. Daniel sat on the old sofa while Sarah worked at the folding table, calling former clients and industry contacts. For the first time since Vanessa left, the apartment no longer felt empty. Near midnight, Sarah glanced at the bare wall above the laptop. What was taped there? A rejection letter. "Where is it now?" Daniel looked toward the trash bin. "I don't need it anymore." Outside, the city continued moving. Trains under streets, elevators through towers, trucks along frozen highways. People still needed to get where they were going. Daniel finally understood. His father had never been ashamed of fixing the path. Neither would he. Meridian's first office stood above a laundromat. The windows rattled whenever the machines below entered their spin cycles. The carpet smelled faintly of detergent. The heating system worked only when kicked near the bottom valve. There were 3 desks. Daniel used the smallest one. Sarah handled operations, sales, and any investor who assumed she was Daniel's assistant. Their 3rd employee was Miguel Santos, a 22-year-old engineer who arrived for his interview, wearing a grocery store uniform. Miguel had no degree. He had taught himself machine learning while working night shifts. Daniel hired him before the interview ended. For 8 months, the 3 of them lived on coffee, instant soup, and unreasonable faith. They lost contracts because Meridian was too small. They lost others because Daniel refused to exaggerate the platform's capabilities. One investor offered $2 million in exchange for control of the company. Daniel declined. Another suggested replacing him with a founder who presented better in executive environments. Sarah escorted that investor out herself. Failure became routine. A pilot program collapsed after a client corrupted the data. A server outage erased 40 hours of work. A major retailer used Meridian's analysis to save $6 million, then refused to pay because the contract language had been poorly written. Daniel spent one Friday evening alone in the office, staring at the company account. They had enough money to make payroll for 2 employees, not 3. On Monday, he called Sarah and Miguel into the conference room, which was actually a storage closet with a whiteboard. "I'll suspend my salary," he said. Sarah folded her arms. "For how long?" "As long as necessary. You haven't paid yourself in 2 months. I still have the depot." Miguel looked at him. "You're still working there?" Daniel nodded. Every weekday, he left Meridian at 5 in the evening, changed clothes in a public restroom, and worked at the shipping depot until midnight. Then he returned to the office and coded until sunrise. He hid the exhaustion well, but not from them. Sarah placed a folder on the table. Inside were 2 signed resignation letters. Daniel stared at her. "What is this?" "Miguel and I resign unless you accept equal salary reductions." "That makes no sense." "It makes more sense than letting the founder collapse in a warehouse." Miguel nodded. "We're not employees if you're the only one allowed to sacrifice." Daniel looked through the thin glass wall at the office they had built from discarded furniture and borrowed equipment. Vanessa used to tell him leadership meant entering a room and making people envy what he had. Daniel had begun to understand something different. Leadership was making people believe their effort would not be wasted. He tore the resignation letters in half. They divided the remaining money equally. 2 weeks later, Sarah secured a meeting with Northline Grocers, a national chain suffering from repeated supply failures. The executives gave Meridian 30 days to prove itself. Daniel barely slept. Meridian did more than predict delays. It identified fraud inside Northline's vendor network, uncovered inefficient routes, and prevented a nationwide product shortage before a holiday weekend. The company saved $84 million in 1 quarter. Northline signed a 5-year contract. Then it purchased a minority stake in Meridian. For the first time, there was money in the account. Daniel paid every overdue bill. He replaced the broken coffee machine. He gave Miguel health insurance. He sent Sarah a bonus large enough to make her stare at the transfer notification in silence. Only after everyone else had been paid did Daniel replace the shoes he had worn since before the divorce. He bought a simple black pair. No logo. No polished gold buckle. Just shoes that fit. That evening, Sarah found him standing alone inside the empty office. The laundromat below had closed. The building was quiet. "You did it," she said. Daniel watched the city through the vibrating glass. No, he could see their reflections behind him. 3 tired figures surrounded by wires, coffee cups and whiteboards covered in impossible equations. "We did enough to begin." 5 years passed. Meridian moved from the room above the laundromat into a glass tower overlooking the Chicago River. 3 employees became 4,000. 1 client became more than 600. The platform Daniel had built in a cold apartment now managed shipping networks, emergency medical supplies, semiconductor distribution, and international trade routes across 43 countries. Business magazines described Meridian as the company that taught global commerce to see the future. They described its founder differently. Daniel avoided interviews. He attended negotiations through secure video calls with his camera disabled. At public events, Sarah represented the company. Photographs of Daniel online were old, grainy, or taken before Meridian became famous. The media gave him a name: the Invisible CEO. Speculation followed. Some believed Daniel was an elderly mathematician. Others insisted Meridian had been created by a secret group of former intelligence officers. One financial program spent an entire hour analyzing a silhouette captured behind Sarah at an airport. Daniel watched none of it. He preferred the engineering floor, where people argued over data and no one cared about his suit. His office contained no awards. Only one object stood on the shelf behind his desk: a brass pocket watch. Sarah had located it 2 years earlier through the pawnshop sales records. It had passed through 3 collectors before Meridian's legal team found the owner. She presented it to Daniel on the day the company reached a valuation of $10 billion. The hand still rested at 642. Daniel never repaired it. Some things were not broken merely because they had stopped. While Meridian rose, Vanessa's life glittered from a distance. Her marriage to Adrian appeared in magazines devoted to luxury homes and society weddings. They purchased a penthouse, hosted charity dinners, and traveled wherever cameras followed. But wealth had not changed Adrian's appetite. It had only made his betrayals more expensive. 2 years into their marriage, photographs surfaced of him leaving a private resort with the daughter of a European investor. Vanessa forgave him publicly. He repeated the betrayal privately. By the time she finally left, Adrian had moved assets beyond her reach and used his influence to damage her position at Harrington Systems. She kept the clothes. The apartment belonged to the bank. The friends disappeared with the invitations. Vanessa returned to Harrington determined to rebuild her reputation, only to discover that the company itself was collapsing. Harrington's logistics division had lost 4 major contracts. Its stock price fell. Debt accumulated. Thousands of employees faced dismissal. The board began searching for a buyer. Only one company possessed the technology and capital to save them: Meridian Global. Vanessa was promoted to vice president of strategic partnerships because she had once cultivated several of Meridian's clients. She saw the acquisition as her way back. No one at Harrington knew the identity of Meridian's founder. They communicated through attorneys, advisors, and Sarah Kim. Vanessa studied every article about the invisible CEO. She learned his estimated net worth, his negotiation style, his preference for acquiring companies without dismantling their workforce. She imagined a severe older man who valued efficiency above emotion. At night, she rehearsed the presentation that might persuade him to preserve her division. During one board meeting, the chairman announced that Meridian CEO would attend the final acquisition gala in person. The room erupted into whispers. Vanessa felt an electric thrill. This was more than a corporate event. It was an opportunity to be seen by one of the most powerful men in the industry. She ordered a new dress. Silver. Almost identical to the one she had worn the night she ended her first marriage. She did not notice the resemblance, but memory did. Across the city, Daniel received the gala schedule. He read the guest list once. Vanessa Cole. His hand stopped on the page. Sarah watched him from the opposite side of the conference table. We can send someone else. Daniel closed the folder. No, you don't owe that company a personal appearance. It isn't about the company. Sarah studied his face. 5 years earlier, Vanessa's name would have opened a wound. Now it merely revealed where the scar had been. Daniel stood and adjusted his cuff. I think it's time the invisible CEO became visible. The Harrington Gala occupied the same hotel where Vanessa had handed Daniel the divorce papers. The chandeliers had been replaced, but the marble staircase remained. So did the gold-trimmed ballroom doors. Daniel noticed both as his car approached the entrance. Rain streaked the dark windows. For one fleeting moment, he remembered walking away from the building without an umbrella, his suit soaked through, Vanessa's final words following him into the street. You'll never become the kind of man a woman can be proud of. The car stopped. A security officer opened the door. Daniel stepped onto the red carpet wearing a midnight blue suit cut precisely to his frame. No visible logo. No theatrical display. His only accessory was his father's pocket watch, resting inside the inner breast pocket. Photographers stood behind barriers. They raised their cameras, then hesitated. Most did not recognize him. Daniel preferred it that way. Sarah joined him near the entrance. You can still enter through the private corridor. Daniel looked at the ballroom doors. No. Inside. Vanessa stood beneath the lights with a champagne glass in her hand. The years had sharpened her beauty. There was more control in her posture now, but less ease. She smiled at board members, investors, and journalists with the concentration of someone maintaining a structure no one else could see was collapsing. She had spent months preparing for this evening. Her presentation was memorized. Her responses to difficult questions were polished. Her future depended on making the right impression. Then she saw Daniel. He entered without an entourage, walking several steps ahead of Sarah. Vanessa's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. For a moment, the ballroom disappeared. She saw the narrow kitchen of their first apartment. Daniel cooking soup while reviewing her tuition bills. Daniel sleeping at the table beside an open laptop. Daniel fastening the silver dress she had worn before leaving him. The memories passed quickly. Pride closed over them. Daniel looked different, certainly. Older. Straighter. The uncertainty she remembered had vanished from his face. But Vanessa's mind found the explanation most comfortable to her. He must work for Meridian. Perhaps he was an engineer, a consultant, a security specialist who had benefited from the company's success. She approached before she could reconsider. Daniel. He turned. Her name did not appear on his face. No anger, no longing, not even surprise. Vanessa. She glanced at his suit. You've done well for yourself. I'm well. The distinction unsettled her. She smiled and gestured toward Sarah, who had paused to speak with Harrington's chairman. I assume you're part of Ms. Kim's technical team. Daniel followed her gaze. You could say that. Vanessa relaxed. Her old instincts returned. You always were good with computers. I'm glad you finally found somewhere that could use you. Daniel said nothing. A former colleague of Vanessa's joined them. She looked Daniel up and down. Is this someone from Meridian? My ex-husband, Vanessa replied. The colleague's eyebrows rose. Vanessa lowered her voice in a gesture of false kindness. He was going through a difficult period when we separated. Daniel watched the bubbles rise inside her glass. Vanessa continued. I'm surprised they brought junior staff to an event like this. Her colleague gave a restrained laugh. Daniel adjusted one cuff. The movement was small, calm, exactly as it had been years earlier when he signed the divorce papers. Vanessa's smile weakened. You haven't changed much, she said. Daniel looked toward the stage, where technicians were preparing the presentation screens. No, he answered. I changed completely. Before she could respond, the hotel's general manager hurried across the ballroom. He walked past Vanessa without acknowledging her and stopped in front of Daniel. Mr. Cole, the board is ready for you backstage. The color shifted slightly in Vanessa's face. Mr. Cole, Daniel nodded to the manager. I'll be there shortly. The general manager bowed his head and left. Vanessa looked from Daniel to Sarah. Something cold moved beneath her ribs. What exactly do you do at Meridian? The ballroom lights began to dim. Daniel turned toward the stage. You're about to find out. Guests moved toward their tables as the orchestra completed its final piece. Vanessa remained standing. Her champagne no longer tasted sweet. Daniel walked toward the front of the ballroom, where Harrington's board members had gathered. They greeted him one by one. Not casually, not as an employee, with deference. The chairman used both hands when shaking his. A government trade representative stepped aside to let Daniel pass. Two journalists began speaking urgently into their phones. Vanessa felt the room rearranging itself around a truth she had failed to understand. No, she whispered. Her colleague leaned closer. What? Vanessa did not answer. On stage, Harrington's chairman approached the microphone. Behind him, the main screen displayed the logos of Harrington Systems and Meridian Global above a silver line. Tonight marks a defining moment for our company, he began. This acquisition will protect more than 12,000 jobs and establish the most advanced logistics network in North America. Applause filled the ballroom. Vanessa could hear only her own pulse. The chairman continued. For years, the world has speculated about the mind behind Meridian Global. He built the company from a single-room operation. His technology has transformed international commerce, disaster relief, medicine, and transportation. The screen changed. Images appeared. Meridian's first office above the laundromat. 3 desks. A broken coffee machine. Daniel standing beside Sarah and Miguel, thinner than Vanessa remembered, wearing the same old shirt she once told him never to wear in public. The audience grew quiet. Vanessa's hand began to tremble. The chairman smiled toward the edge of the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce Meridian's founder and chief executive officer, the architect of tonight's multi-billion-dollar acquisition. A spotlight moved across the ballroom. It found Daniel. Mr. Daniel Cole. The room rose. Hundreds of chairs moved at once. Applause struck the walls like thunder. Vanessa remained motionless among the standing guests. The champagne glass tilted in her hand. A drop spilled across her fingers, cold and unnoticed. Daniel walked toward the stage. He passed within 3 feet of her. Vanessa searched his face for something. Triumph, cruelty, satisfaction, any sign that this moment had been designed for her. He did not look at her. That was the part she would remember most. Not the applause. Not the cameras. Not the enormous letters spelling his name across the screen. The absence of his gaze. Years earlier, Daniel had watched her leave the ballroom with Adrian as though his life were disappearing through the doors. Now he walked past her as though she were simply one guest among hundreds. Sarah waited beside the stairs. Daniel offered her his hand and helped her onto the stage first. The gesture drew another wave of applause. Vanessa remembered how many times Daniel had done that for her. Opening doors, carrying bags, waiting in rain, standing quietly at the edge of rooms while she pursued recognition. She had mistaken gentleness for weakness because weakness was the only form of quiet strength she understood. Daniel reached the podium. He rested both hands on its edges and allowed the applause to fade. When Meridian began, he said, "We had 3 desks, one unreliable server, and a coffee machine that worked only when threatened." Laughter moved through the room. Daniel smiled. Vanessa had forgotten that smile. Not the restrained expression he wore during their final years, but the warm, unguarded one from the beginning of their marriage. The one that had disappeared before she noticed it was gone. "We were rejected by investors, dismissed by competitors, and told repeatedly that our work was too ambitious for a company of our size." Daniel paused. People often confuse current circumstances with permanent identity. The ballroom became still. A struggling person is not necessarily a failure. A quiet person is not necessarily powerless. And a dream without applause is not necessarily a foolish one. Vanessa lowered her eyes. The words contained no accusation. That made them impossible to defend against. Daniel spoke about preserving jobs, investing in employees, and rebuilding Harrington rather than stripping it apart. Every sentence revealed a man she had once been close enough to touch, but had never truly seen. When the speech ended, the audience stood again. Daniel stepped away from the microphone. Behind him, the screen displayed Meridian's new leadership structure. At the top, Daniel, co-founder and chief executive officer. Beneath, it was an estimated acquisition value larger than the fortune Adrian had pretended to possess. Vanessa stared at the name. Her greatest regret did not begin when Daniel walked onto the stage as CEO. It began when she realized he had always been capable of reaching it. She had simply refused to believe in him before the world did. Vanessa found Daniel 40 minutes later on a private terrace above the ballroom. The rain had stopped. Below them, traffic moved along the river in streams of white and red light. Daniel stood near the glass railing with his jacket unbuttoned. The city's reflection surrounded him, making it appear as though he were standing inside the skyline rather than in front of it. Vanessa approached slowly. "Daniel." He turned. The confidence she had maintained throughout the evening had fractured. Her lipstick was still perfect, but her eyes were not. "Do you have a moment?" He glanced toward the ballroom doors. "One." Vanessa wrapped her arms around herself. "Why didn't you tell me? About Meridian? About any of it? You never asked. I asked you about work all the time. You asked when I would earn more. That isn't the same question." She flinched. Daniel's voice remained calm. There was no pleasure in the wound his words created. Vanessa looked through the glass at the ballroom below. "I was under pressure then. My career was moving quickly. Everyone around me had more, and I felt like we were falling behind." "We weren't falling behind. I know that now." "No. You know I became wealthy. Those are different things." Vanessa's mouth tightened. "I made mistakes." Daniel waited. She had rehearsed apologies in the restroom before coming upstairs. Every version sounded inadequate now. "I shouldn't have humiliated you. No, I shouldn't have compared you to Adrian. No, I shouldn't have left the way I did. No." Each quiet answer removed another place for her excuses to hide. Vanessa stepped closer. "Adrian wasn't who I thought he was." Daniel looked at her. "He was exactly who he showed himself to be. You don't understand what happened. I understand enough. He used me. When the company started struggling, he made sure I took the blame for decisions he approved. He turned everyone against me." Daniel's expression did not change. For a moment, Vanessa heard her own words. "Used me. Turned everyone against me." The echoes were too precise. "I deserve that," she whispered. Daniel looked away toward the river. "I don't believe suffering becomes justice simply because it happens to someone who caused pain." Hope entered her face. It was immediate and fragile. "That sounds like the man I married." "The man you married would have mistaken forgiveness for an invitation to return." Vanessa's hope disappeared. Daniel continued. "I forgive you." Her breath caught. "But forgiveness is not restoration." She lowered her eyes. "I've thought about you." "I know." "How could you know?" "People often remember the bridge after the road collapses." Vanessa pressed her lips together. "Is there someone else?" The question surprised him. Not because of its meaning, because it revealed that even now, she believed the ending required another woman. "There is a life," Daniel said. "One I don't have to earn permission to value." Vanessa stepped close enough to touch his sleeve, but stopped before doing so. "We were happy once." "Yes. Doesn't that matter?" "It matters enough that I don't need to rewrite it." Her eyes filled. Daniel felt no satisfaction. Once, her tears would have broken every defense he possessed. Now he saw them for what they were, grief arriving after consequence. "I was afraid," she said. "I thought poverty would trap me forever." Daniel placed one hand in his pocket. His fingers touched the brass watch. "We were never poor in the way you believed. We had almost nothing. We had loyalty, time, trust. We had someone willing to build beside us." He looked at her fully. "You traded those things for the appearance of security." Vanessa wiped beneath one eye. "You must hate me." "I did." The honesty stunned her. "For a long time, I hated the way your voice remained in my head. Every failure sounded like you. Every rejection felt like proof that you had been right." Daniel breathed slowly. "Then one morning, I realized I had built an entire life in response to someone who no longer belonged in it." Vanessa's tears fell silently. "What changed?" "I stopped trying to prove you wrong." He stepped toward the terrace doors and started building what I believed was right. Vanessa turned after him. "Daniel." He paused. Her next words came barely above a whisper. "Was there ever a chance you would come back?" Daniel considered the question, not because he was uncertain, because the past deserved one final moment of honesty. "The night you left, I would have forgiven almost anything if you had turned around." Vanessa closed her eyes. "But you didn't," he said. "And eventually, neither did I." He opened the door. Warm ballroom light spilled across the terrace. Before leaving, Daniel looked at her once more. "You didn't leave because I had no future, Vanessa." She raised her eyes. "You left because you couldn't see one." Then he walked inside. Vanessa remained alone against the glass, surrounded by the reflection of a city she had spent years trying to impress. Below her, Daniel's name still glowed across the stage. But the name was not what broke her. It was the memory of the man who once carried her dreams while she mocked the weight of his own. The acquisition was completed 3 months later. Meridian preserved every Harrington position that could be saved. Employees expected mass dismissals. Instead, Daniel redirected executive bonuses into retraining programs and opened new technical divisions in cities where factories had recently closed. Vanessa remained with the company, not because Daniel intervened. A review committee evaluated her work and offered her a reduced role in regional partnerships. For the first time in years, she accepted a position without demanding that it prove her worth to anyone else. She and Daniel did not speak again. Occasionally, she saw him from a distance, walking through the main office beside junior engineers, eating lunch in the employee cafeteria, holding doors open for people who became visibly nervous in his presence. He had become one of the wealthiest executives in the country without learning the performance of superiority. That, more than his success, reminded Vanessa of everything she had failed to value. One autumn morning, Daniel visited Meridian's first office above the laundromat. The building was scheduled for renovation. The old company sign still hung beside the stairs, its letters faded by weather. Sarah and Miguel met him there. Sarah now served as Meridian's chief operating officer. Miguel led a research division of 600 engineers. They entered the empty room without ceremony. The 3 desks were gone. Pale rectangles on the carpet marked where they had stood. Miguel walked to the corner. "The coffee machine used to be here." "It was a hostile machine," Sarah said. "It feared Daniel." For a moment, they laughed like the exhausted people they had once been. Daniel moved toward the window. The glass no longer rattled because the laundromat below had closed years earlier. From that same spot, he had watched buses pass while calculating whether he could afford electricity. He had believed success would feel like escaping that version of himself. Instead, it felt like standing beside him without shame. Sarah handed Daniel a small wooden box. "What is this?" "Open it." Inside lay the brass pocket watch. Its case had been polished, but the scratches remained. The hand still rested at 6:42. Daniel looked at Sarah. "I told the repair shop not to change the time," she said. "But they restored the mechanism." Daniel wound the crown. A faint ticking began. The sound was almost too small to hear. Yet in the empty office, it filled the room. Daniel closed his fingers around the watch. His father had once told him that people still needed to get where they were going. Daniel had spent years believing that meant movement. Now he understood that sometimes the most important journey was the one back to the person you abandoned inside yourself. That evening, Meridian held a scholarship ceremony for students from low-income families pursuing engineering and logistics. Daniel walked onto the stage without dramatic music. No secret identity remained. No former wife watched from the shadows. No revenge waited behind the applause. In the front row sat parents wearing work uniforms, students holding acceptance letters, and young people who had spent their lives being told that current circumstances were permanent identities. Daniel stood behind the podium. The restored watch ticked inside his jacket. "When I began this company," he said, "I believed success would silence everyone who had doubted me." The audience listened. I was wrong. He looked at the students. Doubt is never silenced for long. There will always be another voice telling you that you are too poor, too inexperienced, too late, too ordinary, or too invisible. He paused. The goal is not to become powerful enough that no one can insult you. The room grew quiet. The goal is to know who you are before they do. After the ceremony, Daniel left through a side entrance. The air carried the first cold promise of winter. A black car waited at the curb, but he did not enter immediately. Across the street, a young delivery driver was struggling to lift several heavy boxes from a van. Daniel removed his jacket, crossed the road, and took the largest box. The driver stared at him. "Sir, you don't have to do that." Daniel adjusted his grip. "I know." Together, they carried the boxes inside. No cameras captured the moment. No journalist turned it into a headline. No audience applauded. When Daniel returned to the car, light from the building fell across the pavement behind him. He looked once at the tower bearing Meridian's name, then at the restored watch in his hand. The second hand moved steadily past 6:42. Time had continued. So had he. Daniel entered the car, and the door closed softly. He had not become successful to make Vanessa regret leaving him. Her regret belonged to her. His peace belonged to him. As the car disappeared into the city lights, the man once dismissed as a failure did not look back at the ballroom, the divorce papers, or the woman who had measured his worth by the emptiness of his pockets. He had spent years building a company powerful enough to change the direction of industries. But his greatest achievement had been quieter. He had rebuilt the part of himself he once sacrificed for love. He did not become a CEO to win her back. He became successful when he finally chose himself. Daniel didn't return to the office after the ceremony. The black sedan rolled quietly through downtown Chicago as the last light of autumn settled over the river. Glass towers reflected gold across the water, while thousands of office windows flickered to life, each one holding people chasing ambitions of their own. He loosened his tie and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The brass pocket watch rested in his palm. For years its hands had remained frozen at 6:42, the moment the hospital declared his father gone. Now the second hand moved steadily. Sarah had insisted on restoring the mechanism without changing the face. "The memory can stay," she had told him. But time shouldn't. She had been right. Some memories deserved to remain exactly where they belonged. People didn't. The following morning, Meridian Global officially assumed control of Harrington Systems. By 6 o'clock, employees were already gathering inside the lobby. Nobody spoke louder than a whisper. Acquisitions never meant good news. Entire departments disappeared overnight. Managers were replaced. Careers ended before lunchtime. Groups of employees stood together clutching coffee cups that had long since gone cold. Some quietly refreshed job websites on their phones. Others stared at the elevators, wondering whether they would still have a desk by sunset. Vanessa arrived shortly before 8. For the first time in years, she wasn't the confident executive everyone instinctively stepped aside for. She still wore an immaculate navy suit. Her posture remained perfect, but confidence had become something she carefully performed instead of naturally possessed. Every employee she passed greeted her politely. None of them smiled. At exactly 9 o'clock, every screen inside the headquarters came alive. The Meridian logo faded into view. Moments later, Daniel appeared, not standing behind a podium, not surrounded by cameras. He was sitting inside a bright conference room overlooking the Chicago skyline, wearing nothing more than a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. There was no luxury on display, no expensive artwork, only a notebook, a glass of water, and sunlight pouring through the windows behind him. His voice filled the building. Good morning. The lobby became completely silent. I know many of you arrived today expecting uncertainty. A few employees lowered their eyes. I know what that feels like. Daniel paused. There was a time when I waited for strangers to decide whether I could keep my job. There was a time when I wondered whether I could afford next month's rent. Vanessa slowly lifted her head. He had never spoken publicly about his past. When Meridian began, Daniel continued, we had 3 employees. He smiled faintly. One tiny office above a laundromat, a coffee machine that only worked if you threatened it, and barely enough money to pay everyone's salary. A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Not because the story was funny, because it was honest. Daniel's expression grew serious again. I know many people believe Meridian acquired Harrington simply because it made financial sense. He shook his head. No. We acquired Harrington because 12,000 families depend on this company. The silence deepened. If profit had been my only goal. He looked directly into the camera. It would have been far cheaper to let Harrington collapse. No one moved. You deserve to know exactly what happens next. Daniel opened the folder lying on the table. There will be no mass layoffs. For several seconds, nobody reacted. Then someone gasped. Another employee covered her mouth with both hands. Near the reception desk, an older warehouse supervisor quietly wiped tears from his eyes. Daniel continued. We're going to retrain. We're going to invest. We're going to rebuild. We're not here to destroy what thousands of people spent decades creating. Applause began somewhere on the 5th floor. Another group joined. Then another. Within moments, the entire building erupted into applause. Employees stood. Some embraced one another. Others simply closed their eyes in relief. Vanessa remained motionless. Not because she didn't want to clap. Because her hands were trembling too violently. Years ago, if Daniel had spoken those same words, she would have dismissed them as idealistic fantasies from a man who didn't understand how business worked. Now billion-dollar corporations trusted him to reshape entire industries. The world hadn't changed. She had simply failed to see who he already was. The executive leadership meeting began at 10. 18 senior executives sat around a polished walnut table overlooking Lake Michigan. One chair remained empty. Exactly at 10 o'clock, the conference room doors opened. Daniel entered. Every person in the room stood. No assistant asked them to. No protocol required it. Respect moved faster than instructions. Vanessa stood as well. Their eyes met for less than a second. Daniel offered the same polite nod he gave every other executive. Professional. Calm. Distant. Nothing more. Oddly, that hurt far more than anger would have. He took his seat at the head of the table, while Sarah placed several reports before him. Let's begin. For more than 3 hours, Daniel discussed strategy, artificial intelligence, supply chains, research investments, employee development, regional expansion. He never once mentioned the past. He never acknowledged the marriage. He never reminded Vanessa of the ballroom, where everything had fallen apart years earlier. Business came first. Always. By the end of the meeting, every executive understood why Meridian had become one of the fastest-growing companies in the world. Daniel listened more than he spoke. He challenged ideas instead of people. When someone made a mistake, he corrected the process rather than humiliating the person. Leadership, Vanessa realized, looked nothing like domination. It looked like responsibility. Eventually, Daniel closed the final folder. Any additional questions? Silence filled the room. Vanessa slowly rose from her chair. I have one. Everyone turned toward her. She had delivered presentations to investors worth billions of dollars. She had negotiated international contracts without hesitation. Yet now she struggled to form a single sentence. Her voice faltered. I owe someone an apology. The room became impossibly still. She looked directly at Daniel. I once believed a person's value could be measured by their income. No one interrupted. I confused temporary circumstances with permanent character. She swallowed. I judged someone who believed in me long before I believed in myself. Her eyes shimmered. I was wrong. The confession hung in the air. I am truly sorry. Nobody looked away. Daniel studied her quietly. His face revealed neither satisfaction nor resentment. Only peace. Finally he spoke. We all have the right to become wiser than we once were. His answer surprised everyone, including Vanessa. There was no punishment, no public humiliation, no attempt to reverse what she had once done to him. Only dignity. Daniel gathered his papers. Meeting adjourned. He stood and walked toward the door. As he passed Vanessa, she instinctively turned. For a heartbeat, she almost reached for his sleeve. But her hand never moved. She understood now. The greatest distance between two people wasn't measured in steps. It was measured by time. Time had carried Daniel somewhere she could no longer follow. He disappeared into the hallway, surrounded by advisors and department heads discussing future projects. Not one of them knew that years earlier he had left this same building soaked by rain, carrying nothing but divorce papers and a broken heart. Vanessa remained standing beside the conference table long after everyone else had left. The room felt strangely enormous. For the first time in her life, she understood something no business school had ever taught her. The opposite of love wasn't hatred. Hatred still demanded emotion. The true ending came when someone looked at you with kindness and no longer carried any desire to return. 3 months later, the acquisition was complete. The Harrington name remained on the building, but everything inside had begun to change. The executive floors lost their locked doors. Department heads were required to spend 1 day each month with entry-level teams. Training rooms remained open after hours. A new employee fund covered emergency medical expenses, childcare, and continuing education. Daniel refused to call any of it generosity. It is infrastructure, he told the board. People cannot build well when they are afraid of losing everything. The decision cost Meridian millions in the first year. It saved the company far more. Productivity rose. Turnover fell. Employees who had spent years waiting to be replaced began proposing ideas again. Harrington slowly stopped feeling like a company waiting to die. It started breathing. Vanessa remained in regional partnerships. Her title was smaller now. Her office no longer had a private reception area or a view of the river. She worked on the 12th floor beside managers she had once outranked, and for the first few weeks, every step through the department felt like a punishment. People knew. Not every detail, but enough. They knew Daniel had once been her husband. They knew she had left before Meridian existed. They knew she had failed to recognize the man the world now praised. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with silent judgment. Vanessa endured both. Years earlier, she would have demanded a transfer or resigned before allowing anyone to watch her fall. Now she arrived early. She stayed late. She listened. When a young analyst made an error in a presentation that nearly cost the team a client, Vanessa did not humiliate her in front of the room. She closed the door, pulled out a chair, and helped her rebuild the entire proposal. The analyst apologized repeatedly. Vanessa shook her head. "Learn from it," she said. "Shame doesn't make people better. It only makes them afraid." The words remained with her long after the meeting ended. She wondered how many lessons arrived disguised as regret. Daniel rarely visited her floor. When he did, he treated her with the same measured courtesy he showed everyone else. He asked about deadlines, reviewed strategy, listened to concerns, then moved on. There was no cruelty in his distance. That made it final. Vanessa had once imagined that success would return him to her, if only because success should have made the past feel smaller. Instead, it had made him clearer. He no longer needed the approval he had once quietly sought in her eyes. He no longer entered rooms wondering whether he belonged. He belonged to himself. That was the one thing she could never reclaim. One evening, nearly a year after the acquisition, Vanessa remained late at the office. The building had emptied into winter darkness. Snow pressed softly against the windows, blurring the skyline beyond the glass. She sat alone at her desk, reviewing an old contract. A notification appeared on her phone. Meridian Global had announced a scholarship fund for students from low-income families pursuing engineering and supply chain technology. The fund was named after Daniel's father, Thomas Cole Opportunity Grant. Vanessa stared at the photograph attached to the announcement. Daniel stood beside a group of students, smiling without restraint. In his hand was the brass pocket watch she remembered from the early years of their marriage. She had once seen it lying on their dresser and asked why he kept something so old. "It doesn't even work," she had said. Daniel had closed his hand around it. "It belonged to my father." At the time, Vanessa had shrugged and returned to choosing shoes for a company dinner. Now she understood. The watch had never been valuable because it kept time. It was valuable because it carried love through it. She placed the phone face down. For several minutes, the only sound in the office was the snow tapping the glass. Then Vanessa opened a blank document. She began writing a letter. Not to Daniel. There was nothing left she could say to him that would not become another demand on his peace. She wrote to herself, to the woman she had been beneath the chandelier, to the woman who believed poverty was more shameful than disloyalty, to the woman who mistook public admiration for private worth. She did not excuse her. She did not condemn her either. She simply wrote the truth. You were afraid of being ordinary, so you became cruel to the person who made ordinary life feel safe. You wanted a man the world would admire. You failed to admire the man who loved you before the world knew his name. When the letter was finished, Vanessa printed it. She folded the page once and placed it inside the same type of white envelope she had used for the divorce papers years earlier. Then she locked it in the bottom drawer of her desk. Not every letter needed to be sent. Some existed only to stop a lie from surviving. Across the city, Meridian continued to expand. Sarah Kim became Chief Operating Officer. Miguel Santos, once a grocery store employee with no degree, led an engineering division of 600 people. The three of them still met every Friday morning. No assistants. No prepared agendas. Only coffee and a whiteboard. They argued as they had in the old office above the laundromat. Sarah rejected Daniel's most cautious ideas. Miguel defended impossible ones. Daniel listened until the right path appeared between them. One Friday, Sarah arrived carrying a small wooden box. She placed it on the table in front of Daniel. What is this? Open it. Inside lay the brass pocket watch. Daniel lifted it carefully. The scratches remained. The faded initials on the back remained. But when he pressed the crown, the second hand began to move. Daniel looked at Sarah. I thought you said some things should stay the way they were. The face stayed the same, she replied. The mechanism needed permission to continue. Daniel listened to the faint ticking. For years, the hands had remained frozen at 6:42, the moment his father died. Now they moved past it. 1 second, then another. Miguel leaned against the table. Your father would probably be proud. Daniel looked down at the watch. No, Sarah raised an eyebrow. Daniel smiled. He would probably ask why we still haven't fixed the shipping delays in South America. They laughed. The sound filled the conference room, warm and unguarded. Daniel placed the watch inside his jacket. For the first time, he did not feel as though carrying it meant carrying grief. It felt like carrying direction. That autumn, he returned to the building where Meridian had begun. The laundromat had closed years earlier. The second-floor office stood empty, waiting to be renovated into luxury apartments. Daniel climbed the narrow stairs alone. The old sign still hung crooked beside the door. Meridian Logistics Solutions. The letters had faded almost completely. Inside, pale rectangles, marked where the 3 desks once stood. The wall near the window still held a small crack from the winter the heating pipes froze. Daniel walked toward it and rested one hand against the glass. Below, buses moved through the street. People hurried beneath umbrellas. A delivery truck stopped beside the curb. Years earlier, Daniel had stood in that same place calculating whether he could afford electricity and server fees in the same month. He had believed success would feel like escaping that man. Now he understood that success was not escape. It was returning without shame. He could still see the old version of himself in the reflection. Thin, exhausted, wearing a coat indoors, trying to hold together a future no one else could see. Daniel did not pity him. He respected him. Without that man, there would be no glass tower, no global company, no thousands of jobs preserved. Without that man, there would be no peace. A building contractor entered behind him. Mr. Cole, we're ready to begin demolition whenever you approve. Daniel looked around the room. Don't demolish it. The contractor hesitated. I'm sorry. Restore it. Daniel turned from the window. Keep the floors. Keep the walls. Keep the old sign. For what purpose? A training center. Daniel glanced toward the place where Sarah's desk had once stood. For founders who cannot afford offices. 6 months later, the Meridian Launch House opened. It offered free workspace, equipment, legal support, and mentorship to entrepreneurs from working-class backgrounds. No one was required to surrender equity. No one had to arrive wearing the right suit. Above the entrance, Daniel placed a single sentence carved into dark wood. Current circumstances are not permanent identity. At the opening ceremony, journalists asked whether the center had been created because of his own difficult beginning. Daniel looked through the glass doors at a young woman setting up a borrowed laptop on one of the desks. Yes, he said. Did the people who doubted you motivate you? Daniel considered the question. Anger gave me energy for a while. Cameras waited. But anger is expensive. It makes every achievement belong to the person who hurt you. The reporters became quiet. So what drove you after that? Daniel looked at the room around him. Responsibility. Years passed. Meridian became one of the most influential logistics companies in the world. Daniel appeared publicly more often, though he never developed a taste for attention. He gave interviews only when the subject mattered. He rejected profiles that focused on his wealth. He declined invitations designed to turn his divorce into entertainment. The story still circulated. The poor husband. The regretful ex-wife. The hidden billionaire. People wanted a revenge tale. Daniel refused to give them one. Vanessa's life became quieter. She never regained the status she once possessed, but in time, she stopped trying. She became known as a demanding but fair manager. She mentored young women entering corporate leadership and warned them, without revealing her own history, never to confuse ambition with contempt. She sold most of the designer jewelry Adrian had given her. With the money, she funded emergency housing for women leaving financially abusive marriages. No announcement was made. No photograph appeared. For once, Vanessa did something good without needing anyone to witness it. She and Daniel crossed paths occasionally. At company events. In elevators. Across crowded conference rooms. Their exchanges remained brief. Polite. Finished. One spring afternoon, they found themselves alone in the lobby as rain began falling outside. Vanessa stood near the doors holding a folder to her chest. Daniel approached from the elevators. For a second, the scene resembled the night their marriage ended. The polished floors. The rain beyond the glass. The distance between them. Vanessa smiled faintly. You still don't carry an umbrella. Daniel looked outside. I keep forgetting. She almost laughed. Then the old tenderness passed between them, not as an invitation, but as recognition. They had once shared a life. That truth no longer needed to become either a weapon or a promise. I heard about the launch center, Vanessa said. Daniel nodded. It's doing well. It suits you. He looked at her. You seem well too. Vanessa lowered her eyes. For a moment. I'm becoming better. There was no performance in the sentence. Daniel believed her. I'm glad. A car stopped outside. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Vanessa watched Daniel move toward it. Daniel. He turned. She had imagined this moment many times. In some versions, she apologized again. In others, she asked whether he had ever loved her after the divorce. But both questions belonged to a past that no longer required answers. So she simply said, Thank you for not becoming cruel. Rain moved in silver lines behind him. Daniel regarded her quietly. That would have meant you still decided who I became. Then he stepped into the car. Vanessa stood inside the lobby as it pulled away. There was sadness in her face, but no desperation. For the first time, she understood that regret did not always need to be cured. Sometimes regret was a teacher that remained after the lesson ended. That evening, Daniel attended Meridian's annual scholarship ceremony. Hundreds of students filled the auditorium. Some arrived with parents still wearing factory uniforms. Others carried acceptance letters folded so many times the edges had softened. Daniel waited backstage with Sarah and Miguel. You hate these speeches, Miguel said. I hate bad speeches. You wrote this one? Daniel held up a single index card. One sentence. Sarah shook her head. That is not a speech. Daniel stepped toward the curtain. It is if I stopped talking afterward. The lights dimmed. His name was announced. Applause rose as he walked onto the stage. Years earlier, he had crossed another stage under another spotlight, while Vanessa stood frozen in the audience. That moment had once seemed like the conclusion of everything. It was not. Revenge had been too small an ending. Daniel reached the podium. The brass watch ticked inside his jacket. He looked at the young faces before him. Some anxious, some hopeful, some already exhausted from fighting circumstances they had never chosen. When I was young, he began, I believed success would prove my worth to everyone who doubted me. The auditorium grew still. I was wrong. He removed the pocket watch and placed it on the podium. My father carried this every day for 32 years. He repaired elevators in buildings owned by men who never knew his name. Daniel glanced down at the moving hands. When I asked why he kept doing such difficult work, he told me, people still need to get where they're going. He looked back at the students. For a long time, I thought he was talking about elevators. A few people smiled. He wasn't. Daniel rested both hands on the podium. Your life may begin in a room no one respects. Your work may be ignored. Your clothes may be old. Your account may be empty. Someone you love may look at your struggle and mistake it for your identity. The silence deepened. Do not borrow their vision of you. In the front row, a young man lowered his head. Build quietly if you must. Begin small if you must. Rest when you need to. Ask for help. Fail without shame. Daniel paused. But never hand another person the authority to decide what your life can become. No music played. No dramatic image appeared behind him. Only the steady ticking of an old watch beneath the lights. When the applause finally came, Daniel stepped away from the podium. He did not feel victorious. Victory required an enemy. He had none. After the ceremony, he left through a side entrance. Cold air moved across the pavement. A black car waited at the curb. Across the street, a young delivery driver struggled with several boxes stacked too high in his arms. Daniel removed his jacket. He crossed the road and took the largest box. The driver stared at him. "Sir, you don't have to do that." Daniel adjusted his grip. "I know." Together, they carried the boxes into the building. No camera followed. No journalist turned the moment into a headline. No audience applauded. When Daniel returned to the curb, the city lights shone across the wet street. He took the brass watch from his pocket. The second hand moved steadily beyond 6:42. Time had continued. So had he. Daniel looked once at the Meridian Tower in the distance. Then he entered the car. The door closed softly. He had not become successful to make Vanessa regret leaving him. Her regret belonged to her. His peace belonged to him. The city moved past the window as the car disappeared into the night. Somewhere behind him stood the ballroom where his marriage ended. Somewhere ahead stood thousands of lives still waiting to begin. Daniel did not look back. He had spent years building a company powerful enough to change the direction of industries. But his greatest achievement had been far quieter. He had rebuilt the part of himself he once abandoned to be loved. He did not walk onto that stage to win his ex-wife back. He walked onto it because, long before the applause began, he had finally chosen himself.